Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into an unanswered sky slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave us soft, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. 5 soldiers went into the dark, but only 4 came back. No shots, no blood. Just a man who ceased to exist. Tonight, we explore the haunting true mystery of Daniel Harper, a missing soldier whose story still echoes through history. Chapter 1. The Night They Counted 4. The cold came first. It moved through the ridge like something alive, quiet, patient, and absolute. It slipped through fabric, settled into bone, and made every breath feel sharper than the last. The kind of cold that didn't just surround a man, but entered him. Daniel Harper pulled his gloves tighter and flexed his fingers once, feeling the stiffness already beginning to set in. Ahead of him, the line of men moved slowly, their shapes barely visible against the uneven darkness of the ridge. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Sergeant Kowalski led at the front, his silhouette steady and deliberate, pausing only when the terrain demanded it. Behind him, Reed kept close, his movements careful. Precise, Daniel thought. The way nervous men tried to control things that couldn't be controlled. Ray followed, quieter than usual, though now and then his boot would scrape against loose stone, followed by a muttered curse under his breath. Daniel walked behind him. Mendoza was somewhere back there in the dark, keeping the rear. You didn't need to see him to know he was there. Mendoza never lost position. 5 men. 1 line. Moving through a night that did not care. They existed. Kowalski's hand rose suddenly. The line stopped. Daniel froze where he stood, one boot half set on uneven ground. The ridge dropped off somewhere to his right. He couldn't see how far, only feel the emptiness waiting there. The wind moved low through the rocks, carrying a sound that almost resembled a voice if you listened long. No one moved. No one asked why. They listened. Daniel held his breath without realizing it, his ears straining against the silence. Somewhere in the distance, far beyond the ridge, something echoed dull and hollow. Artillery, maybe, or just the memory of it, carried on the wind. Kowalski lowered his hand. They moved again. Step. Pause. Step. The ground shifted constantly beneath them, loose gravel, frozen patches, sudden dips that forced each man to adjust without warning. Daniel kept his eyes low, watching Ray's boots ahead of him, placing his own feet where Ray had placed his. That was how you stayed together. That was how you didn't get lost. A small slip ahead. Ray's boots skidded slightly, a quick scrape of stone against stone. Damn it, he whispered. Barely a sound. Daniel reached forward instinctively, his gloved hand catching Ray's shoulder for just a second, steadying him for letting go. Ray nodded without turning. They kept moving. The line stretched, then tightened again as the ridge narrowed. The path angled slightly upward now, forcing them to lean into the climb. Daniel could feel his breathing deepen, the cold air biting harder with each inhale. Somewhere behind him, Mendoza's steps remained steady. Always steady. 5 men. Still 5. Kowalski stopped again. This time, longer. He crouched slightly, scanning ahead, though there was almost nothing to see. The night had flattened everything into shadow and suggestion. Distance meant nothing here. A shape could be 10 feet away or 100. Daniel shifted his weight carefully, his boot pressing into something unstable. A small rock slid loose, tumbling into the darkness below. They all heard it. The faint, fading clatter. No one spoke. The sound disappeared faster than it should have. Daniel frowned slightly. Too deep. He glanced to his right, but there was nothing, only black space where the ridge ended. Kowalski moved again. The line followed. They crossed a narrow section where the ground tilted sharply. Daniel focused completely now, every step deliberate. The man ahead of you. The ground beneath you. Nothing else. Ray moved a little faster here. Too fast. The spacing widened for a moment. Easy read, whispered from ahead, his voice tight. Ray slowed. Daniel adjusted, closing the gap. Everything returned to rhythm. Step. Pause. Step. The patrol continued. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time didn't move normally in places like this. Kowalski raised his hand once more. Stop. The line froze. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the dark. His fingers were numb now. His shoulders ached under the weight of his gear. He listened again, but the night remained unchanged, empty, distant, watching. Kowalski turned slightly, just enough to signal. Check. A silent count. Reed shifted first. I'm here. Ray followed. Yeah. A pause. Daniel opened his mouth, but Kowalski spoke first. Harper. The word cut through the cold, like something solid. Daniel blinked. For a second, he didn't understand. Then he realized the voice wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the space behind Ray. The space where he should have been. Silence answered. Kowalski turned fully now, his shape sharper, more alert. Harper. No response. Reed looked back. Ray turned halfway, confusion already forming. He was right there. Ray whispered. Daniel's chest tightened. He stepped forward instinctively, as if closing distance would fix something that had already broken. Harper, he called, quieter, uncertain. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the wind slipping across the ridge like it had been there all along. Mendoza moved up from the rear. Faster now. I had him in front of me, he said, voice low but certain. Kowalski's eyes scanned the darkness behind them. Then to the sides, then down. The drop. The narrow path. The space they had just crossed. Backtrack, he ordered. They moved quickly, now, but carefully. Too carefully. Each step retraced, each shadow checked, each edge scanned. Harper! Still, nothing. Daniel's heartbeat had changed. Faster now. Sharper. Every sound seemed louder, the scrape of boots, the shift of gear, the breath of the men around him. They spread slightly. Not too far. Never too far. A faint beam of light flickered once, shielded by a hand, sweeping across the ground. Rocks. Frost. Nothing else. Harper. Ray again. Louder, this time. Keep it down, Kowalski snapped. But even he listened harder now. Waiting. Hoping. For anything. A voice. A movement. A mistake that could be corrected. But the night held its shape. Unchanged. Indifferent. Daniel stepped toward the edge where the rock had fallen earlier. He crouched slightly, peering into the darkness below. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. He couldn't even see the bottom. Only blackness layered over more blackness. Anything? Reed asked. Daniel shook his head. Too quickly. Too automatically. Kowalski stood still for a long moment. Then he did what he had to do. He counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The number settled into the air like something final. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. 5 men had walked into the dark. Only 4 were standing in it now. Kowalski's voice came low, controlled, but no longer steady. Harper. The name hung there, unanswered. And for the first time since they had stepped onto the ridge, the night felt larger than it should have. As if it had taken something and decided not to give it back. Chapter 2. The boy before the uniform. Before the frozen ridgelines of Korea. Before patrol rosters and military paperwork. Before his name became attached to the word missing. Daniel J. Harper belonged to a different world entirely. He belonged to seasons. 2 fields that changed color slowly and honestly, to a place where time was measured not by artillery bursts or orders shouted in darkness, but by planting, harvest, snowfall, rain, and the familiar repetition of ordinary days. He was born in rural Iowa, where the land stretched outward in patient lines and where distance often looked peaceful, even when life within it was hard. Roads ran long between farms. Telephone poles crossed open ground, like punctuation marks in a sentence too large to finish. In summer, heat shimmered above gravel paths. In winter, wind moved across the plains with a force that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. People raised their often learned quiet skills early: how to work without complaint, how to notice weather before it arrived, how to fix what could be fixed, how to endure what could not. Daniel learned these things as boys around him did not through speeches, but by watching adults who rarely explained themselves. His father, Thomas Harper, was a practical man by all accounts, not cruel, not warm in theatrical ways, but shaped by a generation that often measured love through labor rather than language. If a fence broke, he repaired it. If crops failed, he began again. If worry visited him, he kept it private. Men like that were common in those years. They had survived depression, uncertainty, and global war headlines long before their sons came of age. They did not always know how to speak tenderness aloud, but they often expressed it through reliability. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, carried a different energy into the house, where Thomas was economy. She was continuity. She remembered birthdays, wrote notes, saved clippings, and treated daily rituals with the seriousness of architecture. Meals were not merely meals. They were gatherings. Letters were not merely paper. They were presents traveling through distance. A swept floor, a folded blanket, a lamp left on in the window. These things mattered because they said someone expected you home. Children raised between such parents often learn balance. Daniel did. From his father, steadiness. From his mother, attentiveness. From the land, patience. Neighbors later remembered him as reserved, though not withdrawn. There's a difference. Some people are silent because they wish to disappear. Others are silent because they are listening. Daniel belonged to the second kind. He noticed small changes in tone during conversations. He remembered details others forgot. If someone was troubled, he often sensed it before it was spoken. Such people are sometimes mistaken for distant when they are simply occupied with more than their own voice. As a boy, he worked where he was needed. He carried tools heavier than his age recommended. He fed animals before dawn on mornings, when frost glazed the yard silver. He stacked wood, repaired hinges, fetched water, lifted sacks, and learned that tiredness was not an argument against responsibility. Yet responsibility alone does not describe a person. There were softer details too. He liked writing, not grand declarations or poetic flourishes, but letters, notes, lists, observations, words arranged carefully, sentences crossed out and rewritten if they felt imprecise. Teachers noticed his handwriting before they noticed his grades. It was neat in the deliberate way of someone who understood the clarity was a kindness. Sometimes, after chores, he would sit near the kitchen window with a pencil while evening gathered outside. The house would settle into its nightly sounds-to-low movement of dishes, floorboards speaking in old wood language, distant wind against the porch screens. Daniel would write to cousins, friends, or no one in particular. Some people keep journals to confess, others keep them to preserve. He seemed interested in preserving moments before they vanished. The first snowfall of one year, the smell of rain entering through open screens, the odd way a dog waited beside an empty gate, a sentence his mother said. That sounded wiser the second time he thought about it. No one around him would have called this unusual. In small towns, private habits often remain private, unless they become troublesome. A quiet boy who worked hard and wrote neatly did not invite concern. He invited trust. School offered him the ordinary mix of routine and possibility. He was not known as the loudest, strongest, or most likely to leave town in spectacular fashion. But he was dependable, and dependability is a form of reputation more durable than popularity. If a task required completion, Daniel was chosen. If a group project needed order, Daniel often created it. If tempers rose among boys too eager to prove themselves, Daniel's presence could lower the room without drawing attention to how some individuals become centers without trying. He was one of them. Yet even in such lives, restlessness can exist quietly. The post-war years transformed America unevenly. Cities expanded, factories promised wages. New technologies entered homes, roads improved. Advertisements spoke constantly of futures available elsewhere. For rural young men, this created a subtle tension. Stay and inherit familiarity. Leave and chase scale. Many wanted both. Daniel rarely announced ambitions, but those close to him sensed he looked beyond the county line in ways previous generations had not. He read newspapers thoroughly. He followed world events with more interest than some expected. Maps fascinated him not for conquest, but for imagination. So many places existed beyond cornfields and weather reports. Then history arrived in the form it often does. Not as drama first, but as policy. The Korean War began in 1950, and with it came troop movements, enlistments, reserve corps, patriotic pressure, practical necessity, and the old American pattern of young men being asked to cross oceans for reasons explained differently depending on who was speaking. Some enlisted from conviction, some from obligation, some for wages, some because everyone expected they would. Motives in wartime are rarely singular. Daniel's decision seems to have come without spectacle. No public speech, no cinematic train platform declaration, no dramatic quarrel at home. More likely a conversation at the kitchen table. Papers reviewed. Silence held longer than usual, and the understanding that life had tilted. His mother likely asked practical questions first. When would he leave? Where would he train? How often could he write? Mothers often use logistics when emotion is too large for immediate language. His father may have nodded more than spoken. Perhaps he offered advice about boots, weather, discipline, money. Men of that generation sometimes hid fear inside instruction. And Daniel, perhaps he seemed calmer than he felt. Many young men do. Training transformed him in visible ways. Hair shorter, posture sharper, movements more economical, civilian hesitation replaced by military rhythm. But deeper changes happen more slowly. You can teach a man to march quickly. It takes longer to teach him how to live with uncertainty. Letters home became more valuable once distance formalized itself. Daniel wrote regularly. He described conditions modestly, likely softening discomfort so family would worry less. Many soldiers did. Mud became inconvenience. Fear became fatigue. Danger became, things are busy here. Love often edits itself to spare those far away. Still, traces always leak through. A line about weather repeated too often. Mention of sleep being scarce. Gratitude for socks, cigarettes, photographs. Anything ordinary enough to remind a person who they were before uniformity replaced individuality. When orders finally placed him on the path to Korea, the geography of his life changed violently. From Iowa fields to military transport, from open plains to ocean crossing, from kitchen lamplight to barracks bulbs. From roads he knew by memory to terrain that would never know his name. There's a moment in every soldier's journey when home stops feeling temporarily distant and begins feeling like another planet. For some, it happens on the ship. For others, on first sight of foreign coastline. For Daniel, perhaps it came in winter air. Korea's cold was infamous sharp, invasive, relentless. It entered gloves, boots, lungs, morale. Men raised in Midwestern winters understood cold, but war adds dimensions. Weather alone does not possess. Cold while armed, cold while alert, cold while tired. Cold while responsible for staying alive. By the time Daniel Harper reached the front, he was still the same person in essential ways. Still observant. Still steady. Still more likely to listen than boast. But now those traits would be tested in an environment where character was no longer private. War reveals people publicly. The man who panics. The man who jokes. The man who obeys. The man who disappears into himself. And the man others unconsciously rely on. Daniel would become the last of these. Soon he would join a small unit of men bound not by hometowns or shared dreams, but by the brutal intimacy of needing one another through darkness. Soon he would learn the rhythm of patrols, the spacing between footsteps, the meaning of silence when danger may be listening. Soon his life would narrow to immediate concerns. Stay warm. Stay awake. Stay low. Stay with the line. But all of that comes later. For now, remember him here. A young man in Iowa, standing near a fence at dusk, wind moving through fields, unaware that history has already begun walking toward him. He still has his full name. He still belongs entirely to the people who love him, and no one yet knows how precious ordinary evenings can become once they are gone. Chapter 3. 5 men, 1 line. By the time Daniel Harper reached the ridgelines of Korea, the world he knew had already begun to feel distant in ways he could not fully explain. The fields, the fence, the quiet evenings by the window, those things still existed somewhere, but they no longer belonged to his present. Here, everything moved differently. Time did not pass in days or weeks. It passed in movements, in orders, in moments where nothing happened and moments where everything could. The cold was the first thing that made the difference clear. It was not the kind of cold he had known back home. This one did not stay outside. It entered through gloves, through boots, through the smallest gaps in clothing, and settled into the body as if it intended to stay. Men spoke less in it, not because they chose silence, but because even words felt heavy. Daniel stood near the edge of the encampment, adjusting the strap of his pack for the 3rd time, even though it did not need adjusting. Around him, other soldiers moved in slow, practiced motions. No one rushed, no one wasted effort. Every action had been repeated enough times to become automatic. Harper. The voice came from behind him. He turned to see Sergeant Kowalski approaching, his expression as steady as ever, his posture straight despite the weight he carried. There was something about Kowalski that made men pay attention without being told to. He did not raise his voice often, but when he spoke, it carried. "You're with us tonight," Kowalski said. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, sir." Kowalski studied him for a moment, not in doubt, but in assessment, as if measuring something beyond what was visible. Then he gave a short nod and moved on without another word. Daniel watched him go, then turned his attention back to his gear. He checked it again, slower this time, not because it needed checking, but because it gave his hands something to do. A voice broke the quiet behind him. "Don't worry. He does that to everyone." Daniel glanced over his shoulder. A man stood there, slightly shorter, his expression carrying the kind of ease that didn't quite belong in a place like this. "Ray DeLuca," the man said, stepping closer and offering a hand. Professional expert in bad timing and worse jokes. Daniel took his hand briefly. "Harper." "I know," Ray said with a faint grin. "Kowalski doesn't forget names. That's how you know you're stuck." Daniel allowed a small, almost invisible smile. Ray leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "First patrol with us. Daniel know that." Ray exhaled through his nose. "You'll be fine. Just stay in line. Don't try to be a hero. And if you hear something weird, it's probably nothing." He paused, then added, "Usually." Another voice cut in from nearby. "That's not helpful." Daniel turned to see a thinner man crouched near a crate, adjusting something with careful precision. His movements were quick, but controlled, as if each action had already been planned in his mind before it happened. "That's Reed," Ray said. "He worries professionally." Reed didn't look up. "Someone asked." Daniel stepped closer, watching him secure the equipment. "What are you checking?" "Everything," Reed replied, "and then I check it again." Ray shook his head. "He's not joking." Reed finally looked up, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Things go wrong when people assume they won't." Daniel nodded. That made sense to him. A 4th figure approached, slower than the others, his steps deliberate and measured. He didn't speak as he joined them, only glanced briefly at each man before settling his gaze outward, toward the dark beyond the camp. "Mendoza," Ray said quietly. The man gave a small nod in acknowledgement, but said nothing more. His presence was different from the others. Not tense like Reed, not loose like Ray, not commanding like Kowalski, just steady. Solid. Daniel noticed it immediately. Kowalski returned then, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the group. "Gear up." No one responded verbally. They simply moved, straps tightened, weapons checked, gloves adjusted, small motions repeated without thought. Daniel fell into position behind Ray. Reed stood ahead of him, Mendoza somewhere behind. Kowalski took the front. 5 men. One line. Kowalski looked back once, his eyes moving from one face to the next, not lingering, but not missing anything either. "Stay close," he said. "No noise, no mistakes." Then he turned and began moving toward the ridge. The others followed. The ground shifted under their boots as they climbed, loose dirt giving way to harder, uneven terrain. The camp fell behind them quickly, its faint light disappearing as they moved deeper into darkness. The night closed in around them. At first, there was still enough light to make out shapes. Rocks, uneven paths, the outline of the man ahead. But as they moved higher, even that began to fade. Shadows deepened. Distance lost meaning. Daniel focused on Ray's movements, placing his feet where Ray placed his. It was easier that way. Safer. A small sound broke the silence. "Tell me something," Ray whispered, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Back home. You got a place you're heading back to?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Yeah." Ray nodded. "Same. I've got plans. Big ones. None of them involve hills." Daniel almost smiled again. Reed's voice came from ahead, tight and controlled. "Less talking." Ray exhaled quietly. "See? Professional warrior." They continued moving. Time stretched. Daniel lost track of how long they had been walking. The rhythm of their steps became the only measure that mattered. Step. Pause. Step. The cold pressed harder now, biting through his gloves, stiffening his fingers. He flexed them once. Then again, ahead, Kowalski raised his hand. They stopped instantly. Daniel held his position, his breathing slow, controlled. He listened, though he wasn't sure what he was listening for. Nothing. Only the wind, low and distant. Kowalski lowered his hand. They moved again. The path narrowed. Daniel felt it before he fully saw it. The ground sloped slightly, uneven, uncertain. To his right, there was nothing. Not empty space exactly, but something close to it. Ray slowed. "Careful," Red whispered. Ray adjusted his footing, his movements more deliberate now. Daniel followed. Behind him, Mendoza's steps remained steady, unchanged. They moved across the narrow section in silence. One by one, each step placed carefully, each movement measured. When they reached wider ground again, the tension eased slightly. Ray let out a quiet breath. "I hate this part." "No one asked," Reed replied. Ray shook his head. "You know, one day I'm going to go somewhere flat. Real flat." Daniel spoke without thinking. "You'll still find something to complain about." Ray glanced back at him, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Yeah, probably." The moment passed. They continued. The ridge climbed again, steeper this time. Daniel felt the strain in his legs, the weight of his gear pulling against him. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his balance as he moved. Above them, the sky was empty. No stars. Just darkness. Kowalski stopped again. Longer, this time. He crouched slightly, scanning ahead. Daniel shifted his weight, his boot pressing into loose ground. A small rock slipped free, falling away into the darkness. They all heard it. The sound faded quickly, too quickly. Daniel frowned slightly, his eyes drawn to the edge. It felt deeper than it should have. "Move," Kowalski whispered. They moved. The line stretched slightly as the terrain shifted again. Ray stepped forward a little faster, then slowed as Reed adjusted ahead of him. Daniel followed, closing the distance. The rhythm returned. Step. Pause. Step. 5 men. Still 5. For now. And in the darkness ahead, The ridge continued without explanation, without warning, waiting for something to break the pattern. Chapter 4. Into the Cold. The order did not come with urgency. It never did. Kowalski gathered them just beyond the edge of the encampment, where the last trace of light failed to reach. The world behind them still held the faint outline of tents, equipment, and men moving through routines that felt almost normal. High ahead of team there was nothing but rising ground and darkness that seemed to absorb everything it touched. "Check everything now," Kowalski said quietly. "Once we move, we don't stop unless I say." No one questioned it. They had already checked their gear, some more than once. But they checked again. Reed crouched low, running his hands over straps, tightening what did not need tightening. Ray adjusted his gloves, then adjusted them again as if the right fit might change something about what lay ahead. Mendoza stood still for a moment, then shifted his pack slightly higher on his shoulders, settling into it like it was part of him. Daniel moved through his own routine with deliberate care. He checked the strap across his chest, the weight on his back, the position of his gloves, the way his boots met the ground. Everything felt in place. That did not make it easier. Kowalski watched them without speaking, his eyes moving from one man to the next. When he was satisfied, he gave a short nod. "Line up." They formed without hesitation. Kowalski at the front, Reed behind him. Ray next. Daniel after Ray. Mendoza at the rear. 5 men. One line. Distance stays tight. Kowalski side, you lose the man in front of you. You stop. You do not guess. A brief pause followed, not long enough to invite questions, just long enough to let the words settle. "Move." Kowalski turned and stepped into the dark. Red followed immediately, then Ray, then Daniel, then Mendoza. The camp disappeared behind them faster than Daniel expected. It did not fade gradually. It was simply there, and then it was not. The cold deepened as they moved upward. It was sharper now, more focused, cutting through layers as if they were not there. Daniel felt it in his hands first, then his face, then his low, creeping stiffness in his legs. Each breath carried a bite that lingered just a second too long. The ground shifted constantly beneath them. Loose gravel rolled underfoot. Frozen patches offered no grip, and uneven stones forced them to adjust without warning. Daniel kept his eyes on Ray's boots, matching each step as closely as he could. That was the only way to stay connected. The wind moved low across the ridge, not strong, but persistent. It carried no clear direction, no clear source, just a steady presence that filled the spaces between sounds. They climbed in silence. Time stretched almost immediately, without light, without markers, without anything to measure distance against. Each step felt disconnected from the last. Minutes could have passed, or only seconds. Daniel had no way of knowing. Ahead, Kowalski raised his hand. The line stopped. Daniel froze mid-step, his boot hovering for a fraction of a second before settling into place. Ailed steel, his breathing slowing, his focus narrowing. They listened. There was nothing. No movement, no distant sound, no sign of anything beyond the ridge itself. Kowalski lowered his hand. They moved again. The path narrowed as they climbed higher. Daniel felt it in the way Ray adjusted his steps, in the way Reed slowed, just slightly ahead. The ground tilted, uneven and uncertain, sloping toward a darkness that felt deeper than the rest. "Careful," Reed whispered. The word barely carried, but it was enough. Ray slowed, placing each step with more attention now. Daniel followed, his focus tightening. He could feel the edge to his right without seeing it, a presence that pulled at his awareness. Behind him, Mendoza's steps remained steady. Always steady. They moved across the narrow section one at a time, each man maintaining the line, each movement controlled. The sound of their boots shifted here, softer, more cautious, as if even the ground understood the risk. Daniel kept his eyes forward, but his senses stretched outward. The air felt different, thinner, maybe, or just quieter in a way that pressed against him. They reached wider ground again. The tension eased slightly, but not completely. Ray exhaled under his breath. "I don't like that part," Reed answered without turning. "No one does." Ray shook his head faintly. I mean, I really don't like it. Daniel spoke quietly. Then, don't think about it. Ray glanced back briefly, then gave a small nod. Yeah, that's the trick, right? No one answered. They continued climbing. The ridge rose in uneven stretches, forcing them to adjust their pace constantly. Sometimes the ground leveled out for a few steps, offering a brief sense of ease. Then it shifted again, pulling them upward or tilting them sideways without warning. Daniel felt the strain building in his legs. The weight of his gear pressed down harder with each step. His breathing deepened, but he kept it controlled, steady, matching the rhythm of the line. Ahead, Kowalski stopped again. This time longer. He crouched slightly, his head turning as he scanned the darkness ahead. There was nothing visible, nothing distinct, but his posture changed just enough to signal attention. The others held position. Daniel stood still, his senses sharpening. He listened harder, searching for something he could not define. A faint sound reached him. Not clear. Not close. Something distant. It faded almost as soon as it appeared. Kowalski remained still for a moment longer, then stood and moved forward again. The line followed. They crossed another stretch of uneven ground, this one more jagged, forcing them to step over sharp edges and small gaps. Daniel adjusted his footing carefully, his balance shifting with each step. A loose stone shifted under Ray's boot. It slipped. A quick scrape of rock against rock. Ray caught himself immediately, his body tightening, his movement controlled. Watch it, Reed whispered. I've got it, Ray replied. Quieter now. Daniel reached forward instinctively, his hand brushing Ray's shoulder for just a second, steadying him before pulling back. Ray gave a small nod without turning. They moved on. The cold pressed harder now. Daniel could feel it settling deeper, slowing his fingers, tightening his muscles. He flexed his hands once, then again, trying to keep them responsive. The ridge climbed again. Steeper this time. Each step required more effort. The ground resisted them, pulling them back slightly, forcing them to lean forward to maintain balance. Above them, the sky remained empty. No stars. No moon. Just a uniform darkness that gave nothing back. Kowalski raised his hand once more. Stop. The line froze instantly. Daniel held his position, his body tense but controlled. He listened again, his focus narrowing to the smallest detail. Nothing changed. The wind moved. The ridge remained. The darkness held. Kowalski turned slightly, just enough to signal. Check. Read. Shift at first. Here. Ray followed. Yeah. A pause. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the moment stretched just long enough to feel wrong. Too long. He spoke. Here. Mendoza's voice came from behind Ott. Here Kowalski nodded once, though the gesture was barely visible. 5 men. Still 5. But something had shifted. Not in the numbers, in the feeling. Daniel couldn't name it, but it stayed with him as they began moving again. A slight imbalance, a hesitation that did not belong. The ridge narrowed once more. The ground sloped again. The darkness deepened, and as they stepped forward into it, something about the night felt heavier, as if it had been waiting, not for them to arrive, but for something else to happen, something that had not happened yet. Chapter 5. The last step. By the time they reached the higher ridge, the cold had settled into them completely. It was no longer something they reacted to. It had become part of the way they moved, the way they breathed, the way their muscles answered each command. Fingers no longer stung, simply obeyed more slowly. Legs no longer burned. They just carried weight without question, even though itself felt quieter, narrowed to only what mattered. Step. Balance. Follow. The line continued. Kowalski did not slow, but his movements became more deliberate. Reed matched him closely, adjusting with a precision that bordered on instinct. Ray followed with more care now, his earlier ease replaced by attention. Daniel stayed behind him, close enough to track every movement. Mendoza remained at the rear, steady as ever, his pace unchanged by the terrain. 5 men. 1 line. The ridge angled upward again, but this time it brought them to a stretch that felt different. The ground was firmer, less broken, but narrower. The slope to the right fell away more sharply, the darkness there deeper, as if the land itself had simply stopped. Daniel felt it before he fully understood it, a quiet awareness pressing at the edges of his mind. They moved onto it without stopping. The path forced them closer together. Each man adjusted slightly, tightening the spacing without needing to be told. Their steps became smaller, more controlled. The wind dropped, not completely, but enough that its absence felt noticeable. For a moment, there was only the sound of their boots. Then, even that seemed softer. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on Ray's back. The outline was faint now, barely visible against the darkness ahead. He focused on movement instead, on the shift of weight. The slight turn of a shoulder, the rhythm of steps. Something felt off. Not wrong in a clear way, just different. He tried to place it, but the thought slipped away before it could form. Ahead, Kowalski raised his hand. "Stop!" The line froze instantly. Daniel held his position, 1 foot slightly forward, his weight balanced carefully. He listened, his breath controlled, his attention reaching outward into the dark. Nothing. No sound. No movement. No reason. Kowalski remained still for a long moment, his head turning slightly as if searching for something just beyond reach. Then he lowered his hand. They moved again. The path narrowed further. Daniel felt the edge now without needing to look. It pulled at his awareness, a quiet presence just beyond his right side. The ground sloped subtly toward it, not enough to force movement, but enough to demand attention. Ray slowed, readjusted ahead. Kowalski continued. The line stretched slightly, then tightened again. Step. Pause. Step. Daniel matched each movement carefully, placing his feet exactly where Ray had placed his. The rhythm returned, but the feeling remained. Something was not quite right. A small shift ahead. Ray adjusted his footing, his boot sliding just slightly before catching. "I'm good," he whispered, almost to himself. Reed did not respond, but his pace slowed just enough to allow space. Daniel followed, closing the gap. Behind him, Mendoza's steps remained steady, unchanged. The ridge leveled for a moment, just enough to breathe. Then it tilted again, sharper this time. The path angled sideways, forcing them to lean into the slope to maintain balance. Each step required more control, more focus. Daniel felt his muscles tighten, his attention narrowing completely. There was no room now for anything beyond the next step. Ray moved carefully, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by concentration. Reed's movements remained precise. Kowalski did not hesitate. The line continued. Then, for just a moment, the spacing changed. It was small. Almost nothing. Ray stepped forward a fraction faster than Reed. Daniel followed a fraction slower. The line stretched. Not enough to break, just enough to notice. Daniel took a slightly longer step to close the distance. His boot landed on firmer ground. He shifted his weight forward, and for the briefest second, his attention slipped from Ray to the ground beneath him. It was nothing, a natural adjustment. The kind that happened 100 times on a path like this, but when he lifted his head again, Ray was closer than he should have been. The space had tightened suddenly. Daniel slowed instinctively, correcting. The rhythm broke. Just for a moment, 10 returned, but something had changed. He could feel it now, more clearly. Not in the terrain, not in the movement, in the space between them. He glanced briefly to his right. The darkness there felt deeper, not empty, just without detail. He looked forward again. Ray continued moving. Reed ahead, Kowalski at the front. Everything appeared as it should, but the feeling remained. A faint unease, difficult to name. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across the ridge in a low, uneven pattern. Daniel adjusted his balance, leaning slightly into the slope as the ground dipped again. Step. Pause. Step. The line moved. Then Kowalski raised his hand once more. Stop! The line froze. Daniel held his position, his breath steady, his focus sharp. Kowalski did not move immediately. He stood still, his posture rigid, his attention fixed ahead. Reed remained motionless. Ray exhaled quietly. Daniel waited. Mendoza stood behind him, silent. Seconds passed. Or longer. Daniel couldn't tell. Then Kowalski lowered his hand slightly, signaling a brief hold rather than movement. They remained in place. The silence deepened. Daniel listened again, searching for something to explain the tension that had settled over them. Nothing answered. No sound. No movement. Only the quiet pressure of the ridge and the darkness surrounding it. Kowalski shifted slightly, his head turning as if measuring distance, direction, something unseen. Tina spoke, his voice low. Stay tight. It was not a new instruction, but the way he said it made it feel like one. They moved again. Closer now. The spacing reduced, each man almost within reach of the next. Daniel stepped forward, aligning himself more precisely behind Ray. The path narrowed once more. The slope increased. The edge to the right felt closer. The darkness, deeper. Daniel placed his foot carefully. Then another, his attention locked forward. His breathing steady. The line moved, and somewhere within that movement, within that rhythm that had carried them this far, something slipped. Not loudly. Not violently. Not even noticeably. Just a small break. A moment too slight to mark. Too quiet to hear. Too brief to stop. And in that moment, Daniel Harper took one more step. The line continued. The ridge remained. The night did not change, but the space he had occupied no longer held him. Chapter 6. The moment no one saw. For a few seconds after it happened, nothing changed. The line continued forward with the same careful rhythm. Each man focused on the next step, the next shift of weight, the next piece of ground that had to be trusted before it could be left behind. Kowalski moved with steady purpose at the front. Reed followed with his usual precision, and Ray kept his balance with more care than before. Mendoza remained at the rear, his pace even, his attention quiet and constant. 4 men. But none of them knew it yet. The ridge did not react. The wind did not rise. The darkness did not shift to mark what had just been taken from it. There was no sound of a foal, no cry cut short, no sudden break in the pattern that could be pointed to and named. Only the absence. And absence does not announce itself. It waits to be noticed. Ray adjusted his footing again. Slower now, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter. He glanced once, toward the ground, then forward again, keeping Reed's silhouette in sight. You good, he whispered, barely turning his head. Reed gave a short nod, more felt than seen. Keep moving. Ray exhaled softly and continued. Behind him, the space where Daniel had been remained open. Not wide, not obvious, just in Ohuk. Mendoza moved forward a fraction, not out of urgency, but out of instinct, maintaining the line as he always did. His steps filled the rhythm without hesitation. If he noticed the difference, he did not show it. Kowalski slowed slightly at the front, the terrain shifting again beneath his boots. The path angled upward, forcing him to adjust his stance. He raised his hand briefly, signaling caution rather than a full stop. The line compressed. Ray stepped forward. Mendoza stepped forward. The gap closed. Still, no one spoke. Still, no one turned. The ridge continued. The ground widened, just enough to allow a steadier pace. The tension in their steps eased slightly, though none of them relaxed fully. They had learned not to. A minute passed, or 2. Time had no shape here. Kowalski raised his hand again. Stop. The line froze instantly. Red halted first. Ray stopped behind him. Mendoza stopped behind Ray. 4 men stood in the dark, breathing, listening, waiting. Kowalski remained still for a moment longer than before, his head turning slightly as he scanned the darkness ahead. Something had caught his attention. Not clearly, not urgently, but enough to pause. Then he gave the signal. Check. It was routine. It always was. Reed spoke first, his voice low and controlled. Here. Ray followed, quieter. Yeah. A pause. Small, barely noticeable. Kowalski did not turn immediately. Harper. The name moved through the cold air without force, but it did not need it. No answer came. Kowalski turned slightly now, his attention shifting back along the line. Harper. Ray frowned, glancing over his shoulder. He's right. The word stopped, because he wasn't. The space behind him held nothing, just darkness. Ray turned further now, his body twisting as far as the narrow ground allowed. Harper. Reed looked back as well, his expression tightening, his mind already moving faster than the moment. Mendoza stepped forward once, closing the gap that should not have been there. I had him in front of me, Mendoza said, his voice steady but certain. Kowalski's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. He turned fully now, his eyes scanning the path they had just crossed. Backtrack, he ordered. The word carried quiet authority. They moved immediately. Carefully, each step retraced with more urgency than before, but still controlled. The terrain did not allow for anything else. Ray led this time, moving back along the ridge, his eyes searching the ground, the edges, the spaces between rocks. Harper, he called, louder now. Keep it down, Kowalski snapped. But even he listened harder now. They moved across the narrow section again, slower, more deliberate. Every footstep placed with care, every shadow examined. Harper. Ray again, his voice strained. No answer. Reed crouched briefly, his hand brushing over the ground as if expecting to find anything that could explain what had happened. There was nothing. No disturbed earth, no broken edge, no sign of a slip, a fall, a struggle. Just the same ground they had walked minutes before. Unchanged. Mendoza moved toward the edge, stopping just short of it. He looked down into the darkness, his expression unreadable. Anything? Kowalski asked. Mendoza shook his head once. Too deep. Ray stepped closer, peering down as well, his breathing uneven now. He could have slipped. No sound, Reed said immediately. Ray looked at him. Doesn't mean. It does, Reed cut in, his voice tight. You would have heard it. Silence followed. Not agreement, but nothing stronger to replace it. Kowalski moved to the edge himself, his gaze steady as he looked into the darkness below. He remained there for a moment, longer than the others had, as if expecting something to reveal itself. It didn't. He turned back to the group. Spread out, he said, but stay in sight. They moved carefully, widening their positions just enough to cover more ground. Ray checked along the path they had crossed. Reed examined the rocks and uneven surfaces. Mendoza remained near the edge, watching below. Harper, Ray called again, his voice breaking slightly now. The sound carried out into the darkness and disappeared. No echo, no reply. Nothing. Daniel's name hung in the air for a moment longer, then faded like everything else. Reed straightened slowly, his movements controlled, but his eyes sharper now. This doesn't make sense, he said quietly. No, Kowalski replied. It doesn't. Ray turned back toward them, his expression strained. He was right behind me. He was there. Mendoza spoke again, calm but firm, and I had him ahead of me. Kowalski looked between them, his mind working through the impossible space between those two statements. There was no answer there, only contradiction, only absence. He stepped back, toward the center of the path, his posture straightening, his voice returning to command. "Form up." They hesitated, just for a second. Then they obeyed. Reed moved into position. Ray followed, slower now. Mendoza stepped into place at the rear. 4 men. 1 line. Kowalski looked at them each in turn, his expression unreadable. Then he did what had to be done. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The number settled over them like weight. No one spoke. No one needed to. The space where a 5th man had been did not close. It remained. A gap that could not be filled. Kowalski's voice came low. "We moved back." No one argued. They turned and began the slow descent along the ridge. Behind them, the path remained exactly as it had been. No mark, no sign, no answer. Only the quiet certainty that somewhere between one step and the next, Daniel Harper had been there, and then he hadn't. Chapter 7. Harper. They did not leave right away. The order to move back had been given, but no one truly moved. Not at first. The ridge held them there, suspended between action and disbelief, as if the ground itself expected them to try again, expected them to correct something that had already slipped beyond reach. Ray was the first to break. "Harper." This time, he didn't lower his voice. The name cut through the cold, sharp and uneven, carrying farther than it should have. It moved out into the darkness and disappeared without resistance, without echo, without anything to meet it on the other side. Ray Kowalski said, firm, but Ray wasn't listening anymore. "He's here," he insisted, turning in place as much as the narrow ground allowed. "He has to be." He didn't just. His words faltered, not because he lacked them, but because none of them worked. Reed stepped forward slightly, his voice tight but controlled. "Calling won't help." Ray looked at him. "Doing nothing won't either." "We're not doing nothing," Reed replied. "We're thinking." Ray shook his head. "You think your way through this? Then tell me how a man disappears without a sound." Reed didn't answer, because there wasn't one. Kowalski stepped between them without force, but with enough presence to stop the exchange before it grew into something worse. "Enough," he said quietly. The words settled over them, not as a command, but as a boundary. Ray exhaled sharply and looked away, his breathing uneven now. Reed returned his attention to the ground, though his movements had slowed, his usual precision replaced by something less certain. Mendoza remained near the edge, his posture unchanged, his gaze still directed into the darkness below. If he felt the shift in the group, he did not show it. Kowalski turned his attention back to the ridge behind them. "We search again," he said. "Same ground. Slower." No one objected. They spread out just enough to widen their view, but not enough to lose each other. Every step was deliberate now, every movement measured against the possibility that something had been missed. Ray moved first, retracing his path with sharper focus. He crouched once, his hand brushing over the ground as if expecting to feel something hidden just beneath the surface. "Harper," he called again, louder now. The sound stretched outward and vanished. Reed moved along the opposite side, his eyes scanning every detail, the angle of rocks, the texture of frozen dirt, the places where a misstep might leave a mark. He paused often, not because he found anything, but because he needed to be certain there was nothing to find. "This doesn't happen," he muttered, almost to himself. Kowalski heard him. "It did," he said. Reed looked up, frustration tightening his expression. "Then we missed something." "Then find it," Kowalski replied. Reed nodded once and returned to his search. Mendoza shifted his position slightly, stepping closer to the edge again. He crouched low this time, leaning forward just enough to look deeper into the drop below. "Anything?" Kowalski asked. Mendoza remained still for a moment before answering. "No, nothing at all." Mendoza shook his head. "If he went over, we'd hear something. Or see something." Ray turned toward him quickly. "Unless he didn't fall." The words hung there. Red straightened slowly. What does that even mean? Ray hesitated, then spoke again, quieter this time. I don't know. He was there. Right behind me. Then he wasn't. That's not a fall. That's not anything I understand. Kowalski watched him carefully. Stick to what you know. Ray let out a short, humorless breath. That's the problem. I don't know anything right now. Silence followed, not the quiet they had known before. This one was heavier, uncertain. Daniel's absence had changed it. Kowalski stepped back toward the center of the ridge. We're going over it again, he said. Every step. No assumptions. They moved, slower than before. More carefully than before. Ray led again, his movements tighter, his attention fixed on the ground as if it might shift and reveal something if he stared long enough. Red followed, his eyes moving constantly, measuring distances, angles, possibilities. Kowalski stayed just behind them, his presence steady, his focus divided between the path and the men. Mendoza remained at the rear, watching everything without speaking. For men, searching for a fifth. They reached the narrow section again, the place where the ridge tightened and the ground tilted toward the unseen drop. Ray stopped there. This is it, he said. Reed stepped closer. You're sure? Ray nodded. Yeah. This is where it started to feel off. Off. Kowalski moved beside them, his gaze sweeping the area. Then we slow it down. They did. Each step across that section was deliberate, almost exaggerated in its care. They moved one at a time now, not as a line but as individuals tracing a shared path. Ray went first. He placed his foot exactly where he remembered placing it before. 10x. 10x. He stopped halfway across and looked back. This is where I slipped, he said. Red nodded. Small slide. You caught yourself. Ray swallowed. Yeah. Kowalski stepped forward next, his movements controlled, his eyes scanning not just the ground, but the space around it. Reed followed, then paused, crouching low to examine a patch of frozen dirt. There's nothing here, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. No marks, no break, no sign of anything shifting. Mendoza stepped onto the narrow section last, his balance steady despite the angle. Daniel had walked this same path, placed his feet on this same ground, and left nothing behind. Ray moved to the edge again, this time leaning further, his caution slipping just enough to show how much the uncertainty was affecting him. Harper, he called, his voice louder than before. The name carried out into the darkness. It faded, and then nothing. No echo. No answer. No movement below. Just the same endless black. Ray stepped back slowly, shaking his head. This doesn't make sense. No, Kowalski said again. It doesn't. Reed stood, his expression tighter now. We're missing something. Kowalski looked at him. Then tell me what. Reed opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing to say, because whatever they had missed was not something they could see. Kowalski let the silence settle for a moment longer. Then he made the decision. We go back, he said. Ray looked at him. And then what? Kowalski held his gaze. Then we come back with more men. More light. We do it properly. Ray hesitated. And if he's still out here? Kowalski's voice remained steady. Then we find him. It was not a promise, but it was the closest thing to one they had. They formed the line again. 4 men. 1. Space missing. Kowalski at the front. Reed behind him. Ray next. Mendoza at the rear. They turned and began the slow descent. Behind them, the ridge remained unchanged. The narrow path. The silent drop. The place where a man had vanished without a trace. Ray glanced back once more, his eyes searching the darkness as if it might return something if he looked hard enough. It didn't. It never did. And as they moved away, Daniel's name lingered in the air, just long enough to fade completely, leaving nothing behind except the question that none of them could answer. What had happened in the space between one step and the next? Chapter 8. The search that found nothing. By the time the first light reached the ridge, the night had already taken its shape and sealed it. The return to camp had been quiet, not the kind of silence that came from discipline, but the kind that followed something none of them could explain. 4 men had walked back through the perimeter, and even before a word was spoken, others could see that something was wrong. It was there in the way they moved, in the way they avoided looking at one another for too long, in the space that existed where a 5th man should have been. Kowalski gave the report without hesitation. He did not add anything unnecessary, did not speculate, did not soften the facts. 5 men had gone out. 4 had returned. 1 was missing along the ridge. No sign of a fall. No sound. No trace. Orders followed quickly. At first light, they would go back. More men. More coverage. A full search. And now, under a pale sky that revealed everything the night had hidden, they stood again at the base of the ridge. It looked different. That was the first thing Daniel would have noticed, had he been there to see it. The darkness had given the ridge a kind of mystery, a sense that anything could be concealed within it. But in daylight, it became something else entirely exposed, defined, almost ordinary in its harshness. The slopes were rough, but visible. The edges were clear. The drop to the right was steep, but not impossible to measure. It should have made things easier. It didn't. "Spread out," the officer in charge said, his voice carrying across the group. "We move up in sections. Call out anything unusual. Don't assume it's nothing." There were more of them now, a dozen, maybe more. Boots pressed into the frozen ground as they began to climb, their movements less synchronized than the night patrol, but broader, covering more space. Kowalski led his original group back to the same path they had taken before. Reed stayed close to him. Ray moved slightly ahead, his attention fixed on the ground. Mendoza remained just behind, his pace steady, his focus unchanged. No one spoke at first. There was no need. The ridge held its silence, even in daylight. They reached the narrow section sooner than expected. Without the darkness, it seemed smaller, less intimidating. The path was clearly visible, the slope defined, the drop measurable. Ray stopped there. "This is it," he said, his voice quieter now. Reed stepped beside him, scanning the ground again, his eyes sharper in the light. "We should see something." They all looked. The ground was rough, uneven, but undisturbed. No marks, no displaced stones. No sign that a man had slipped, struggled, or even paused. Kowalski crouched slightly, his hand brushing over the surface. "Nothing," he said. Ray shook his head. "There has to be something." "There doesn't," Reed replied, though the words sounded less certain than before. Another group approached from the side, spreading out along the ridge. One of them called out, "Clear here." A second voice followed from further up. Nothing. The calls continued, moving across the ridge in waves, each one confirming the same thing. Nothing. Ray moved closer to the edge, looking down again, this time with full daylight, revealing what the night had hidden. The drop was steep, jagged, but not endless. If someone had fallen, there would be a path, broken rock, dislodged dirt, something to mark the descent. There was none. "Check below," the officer ordered. 2 men moved carefully along the lower path, circling down toward the base of the slope. Others followed, spreading out to cover more ground. Kowalski remained at the top, watching. Minutes passed, then longer. The men below moved slowly, scanning every inch of ground, every cluster of rocks, every shadow that might conceal something. "Anything?" Someone called down. A voice answered from below. Negative. They searched further. Nothing. Ray turned away from the edge, his expression tightening. He didn't fall. Reed didn't respond immediately. He kept scanning the ground, as if repetition might produce a different result. "He had to," Reed said finally, though the words lacked conviction. Mendoza spoke quietly. "Then where is he?" No one answered, because there was nowhere else to look. The ridge stretched on in both directions, exposed and empty. The path they had taken was clear, uninterrupted. There were no side trails, no hidden drops beyond the one they had already checked. Nothing that explained how a man could simply stop existing in the space between one step and the next. The search continued for hours. They moved beyond the original point, expanding outward, covering more ground than the patrol had ever touched. They checked every possible path, every possible explanation. They looked for signs of enemy movement, for tracks that did not belong, for anything that might suggest interference. There was nothing. Not a footprint out of place. Not a mark on the ground. Not a single detail that broke the pattern of the ridge. By midday, the sun sat high enough to cast sharp shadows across the terrain. The cold remained, but it had lost its edge. The ridge no longer felt mysterious. It felt empty. The officer gathered them again near the original point. Report. He said, one by one, the responses came. Nothing. Clear. No sign. Kowalski stepped forward last. Same, he said. The officer studied him for a moment. You're certain this is the location? Yes. No deviation from the path? No. The officer looked out over the ridge, his expression unreadable. Then we expand further, he said. We don't stop until we have something. They did. They searched beyond the ridge, into the surrounding terrain, into areas that Daniel had never reached. They checked routes that led nowhere, examined ground that held no connection to the disappearance. Still nothing. By late afternoon, the energy had shifted. Not into certainty, into fatigue, the kind that came not from physical effort, but from repetition without result. Every step taken without finding anything made the absence heavier, more difficult to explain. Ray moved slower now, his earlier urgency fading into something quieter. Reed had stopped questioning every detail, not because he was satisfied, but because there were no more details to question. Mendoza remained the same, his silence unchanged, though his gaze lingered longer on the ridge than before. Kowalski stood at the original point once more, looking out over the path they had walked. It was all there, every step, every turn, every piece of ground. And yet, nothing. The officer approached him. We'll continue tomorrow, he said, with more men. Kowalski nodded once, but they both understood something that did not need to be spoken. More men would not change what had already been found, or what hadn't. As the sun began to lower, the search was called off for the day. The men started back down the ridge, their movements slower now, their purpose less defined. Ray lingered for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the place where Daniel had last been. Harper, he said quietly. Not a call, not a question, just a name. The ridge gave nothing back. It never had. And as they walked away, the ground behind them remained exactly as it had been when they arrived. Unmarked, unchanged, as if no one had ever disappeared there at all. Chapter 9. The telegram. The knock came in the late afternoon, at the hour when the light softened and the day began to fold into evening. It was not loud, but it carried the kind of weight that made it impossible to ignore. Inside the house, Daniel's mother paused where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table. For a moment, she did not move. Something in the sound held her there, as if it had arrived not just at the door, but inside her. The knock came again. She walked slowly across the room, each step measured, her eyes fixed on the door as if it might change before she reached it. The house felt quieter than usual. Even the small sounds that usually filled it seemed to have stepped aside. She opened the door. A man stood there in uniform, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that tried to be neutral and failed. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he handed her the envelope. That was all it took. She didn't open it right away. Her hands held it carefully, almost gently, as if the paper itself might react to being touched too quickly. Her eyes moved over the surface, taking in details that did not matter: the stamp, the fold, the way her name had been written. Behind her, the house remained still. "Ma'am?" the man said quietly. She nodded once, though she had not yet read the words that required acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied. Her voice did not break. Not yet. He stepped back, giving her space, then turned and walked away without looking back. His footsteps faded along the path, leaving the doorway open to a silence that felt heavier than before. She closed the door slowly. The envelope remained in her hands. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then she turned and walked back to the table, sitting down carefully as if the act required more effort than usual. The chair creaked softly beneath her, a familiar sound that felt suddenly distant. Her fingers moved to the edge of the envelope. She opened it. The paper inside unfolded with a faint, dry sound. Her eyes found the words quickly, moving across them with a focus that allowed no distraction. She read them once. Then again, the words did not change. They did not soften. They remained exactly what they were. Missing in action. The phrase settled into the room without sound. It did not explain. It did not comfort. It simply existed. Her hands lowered slightly, the paper still held between her fingers. She did not cry. Not immediately. Instead, she sat, very still, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the table, as if the meaning might reveal itself. If she waited long enough, the front door opened again. Her husband stepped inside, his boots carrying the weight of the day, his presence filling the room in the way it always had. He paused when he saw her sitting there. Something in her posture stopped him. He closed the door behind him, slower this time. "What is it?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she held out the paper. He took it, his movement steady, his expression unchanged as he read. His eyes moved across the words once, then again. When he finished, he lowered the paper slightly, his grip tightening just enough to crease it at the edges. "Missing," he said. Not as a question, as a fact. She nodded. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer waiting. It had already arrived. "He's not," she began, then stopped. The word did not come. He looked at her. "No," he said. It was not certainty, but it was enough. She pressed her hands together lightly, her fingers interlocking as if they needed something to hold. "They don't know," she said. "No." The paper remained in his hand. He folded it once, carefully, then again, returning it to its original shape. He set it on the table between them, where it seemed smaller than it had before. "What happened?" she asked. He did not answer, because there was no answer on the page, only the absence of one. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky shifting into deeper shades as evening settled over the fields. The world beyond the house moved as it always did. Cars passing on distant roads, wind brushing through the land, the slow rhythm of a place untouched by what had just arrived inside. She looked toward the window, her eyes unfocused. "He would have written," she said quietly. "If he could." Her husband nodded. "Yes." She held on to that. Not as proof, but as something that felt true. The room grew darker as the light faded. Neither of them moved to turn on the lamp. They remained where they were, sitting across from each other, the paper between them, the words on it, unchanged. Missing in action, not gone, not returned, somewhere in between. And in that space, uncertainty began its slow, quiet work. Later, when the night had fully settled and the house had fallen into stillness, she rose from the table and moved toward the window. She stood there for a long time, looking out into the darkness that stretched across the fields. It looked the same, unbroken, endless. She placed her hand lightly against the glass, as if measuring the distance between where she stood and wherever her son might be. There was no way to know, no direction to follow, only the quiet, persistent belief that somewhere, beyond what she could see, he was still there, waiting, or lost, or something in between. Behind her, the house remained unchanged. The chair, the table, the folded letter resting where it had been placed, and within those walls, a new kind of silence settled in, not empty, not full, just unresolved, and it would remain that way for a very long time. Chapter 10. Theories begin. The story did not end on the ridge. It moved with them, back into the camp, into the routines that tried to resume but never quite did, into the spaces where men spoke in lower voices than before. Daniel Harper was no longer present, but he had not left them. His absence followed them, settled into their thoughts, into their conversations, into the pauses between words. At first, no one said much. The official version remained simple. A soldier missing during patrol. Search ongoing. No confirmed cause. It was written cleanly, filed neatly, spoken without hesitation. But among the men who had been there, the silence did not hold. It couldn't. Ray sat outside one of the tents, his back against a crate, his hands resting loosely in front of him. He stared at the ground, not really seeing it, his mind replaying the same moment over and over again. He was right there, he said. Reed stood nearby, arms crossed, his posture rigid. You've said that. Reed looked up. Because it's true. I'm not saying it isn't. Then explain it. Reed didn't answer immediately. He had been trying to do exactly that since the moment it happened, breaking it down, reconstructing it piece by piece, looking for something that made sense. He could have slipped, Reed said finally. A bad step, lost balance. Ray shook his head. We would have heard it. Not necessarily. Yeah, Ray replied, his voice tightening. We would have. Reed exhaled slowly, forcing his frustration down. Then what do you think happened? Ray hesitated. That was the problem. I don't know, he admitted. I just know what didn't happen. Mendoza stood a short distance away, leaning slightly against a support beam. He had been quiet since they returned, speaking only when necessary. Now, he looked toward them, his expression steady. He didn't fool, Mendoza said. Reed turned to him. You don't know that. Mendoza held his gaze. I do. How? Mendoza didn't answer right away. He considered the question, then spoke carefully. Because there was no break, he said. No sound, no movement, nothing that changes when someone falls. Reed frowned. That's not proof. It's enough. Ray looked between them. Then where is he? No one answered. Because that was the question that remained. Not how. Not why. Where? Kowalski approached them then, his presence drawing their attention without effort. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from one to the other. Speculation doesn't help, he said. Ray let out a quiet breath. Doing nothing doesn't help either. We're not doing nothing, Kowalski replied. We're waiting for facts. Ray shook his head. There aren't any. Kowalski didn't argue. Because that at least was true. The search had produced nothing. No evidence. No direction. No indication that Daniel had moved beyond the path they had walked. Only absence. And absence did not explain itself. Later that evening, the discussion continued in smaller groups, in quieter tones, in conversations that stopped when others approached and resumed when they left. Some kept their thoughts to themselves. Others didn't. I heard of something like this before, one soldier said, his voice low, almost cautious. Not here. Different place. Guy just gone. That doesn't mean anything. Another replied quickly. People get lost. They wander off. It happens. Not like that. How do you know? The first man hesitated. I don't. Just saying. Reed sat nearby, listening without joining in. He didn't like conversations like this. They moved too far from what could be measured, too far from what could be tested. But even he could not ignore the gap in logic. A man does not disappear without cause. That was a rule. Something had caused it. The problem was finding what. Ray joined another group, his tone sharper now, his patience thinner. I'm telling you. He was there, he said. I could feel him behind me. You know how you can tell? The way someone moves, the way the line holds together. It was normal. Then it wasn't. So what changed? Someone asked. Ray looked at him. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Maybe he stepped off without realizing. Ray shook his head immediately. No. You can't be sure. I am. The certainty in his voice surprised even him, because it wasn't based on evidence. It was based on something else, something harder to explain. Mendoza remained apart from most of the conversations, listening more than speaking. When he did speak, it was brief, direct. "He was between us," he said once. Then he wasn't. No theory added to that. No explanation followed. Kowalski spent most of the evening reviewing reports, speaking with officers, going over the same details again and again. His account did not change. It did not expand. It remained precise, controlled, limited to what he knew for certain. 5 men entered the ridge. 4 men returned. No sound. No trace. No explanation. At one point, an officer asked him directly, "What do you think happened?" Kowalski paused. Not because he didn't have thoughts, but because none of them met the standard he required. "I don't know," he said. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Keep it that way," he replied, "until we do." Kowalski understood the instruction. Speculation had no place in reports, but it had already taken root among the men, and it would not leave easily. As night settled over the camp again, the same darkness returned to Sama Cold, the same ridge rising beyond the perimeter, but it no longer felt the same. It had changed, not physically, but in meaning. It was no longer just terrain. It was a place where something had happened that could not be explained, a place that held a question without an answer. Ray stood at the edge of the camp, looking out toward it. "You think he's still out there?" he asked quietly. Reed stood beside him, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the same direction. "I don't know," Reed said. Ray nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's the problem." They stood there for a while, saying nothing more. Behind them, the camp continued its routines. Men moving, voices low, life going on as it had to. But out on the ridge, nothing moved, nothing changed. And somewhere within that stillness, the space where Daniel Harper had last been remained exactly as it was, unanswered. And now, no longer silent, because in the absence of truth, theories had begun. Chapter 11. The war ends, but not this. Time did not move the same way after that. Days continued, as they always did in war, measured by orders, routines, and the slow rotation of men through duties that did not wait for understanding. The ridge remained where it had always been. The cold came and went in cycles. Patrols continued. Reports were filed. Names were recorded. But something had shifted. Daniel Harper's absence did not fade with repetition. It did not become easier to carry. Instead, it settled into the background of everything, quiet but persistent, like a sound too low to hear directly but impossible to ignore. The search continued for several days. Different units, wider areas, longer hours. They moved beyond the ridge, into neighboring terrain, into places that held no connection except proximity. They checked paths that had never been walked, examined ground that showed no sign of disturbance. Each new effort brought the same result. Nothing. Eventually, the scale of the search began to narrow, not because the need had changed, but because the reality of the situation had begun to assert itself. Resources were limited, attention shifted. Other priorities demanded focus. The official status remained unchanged. Missing in action. The phrase followed Daniel's name through every report, every document, every mention that required one. It did not evolve. It did not resolve. It stayed exactly where it had been placed. Among the men who had been there, the absence lingered in a different way. Ray spoke of it less, but thought of it more. His usual ease did not return, not completely. He still joked when expected, still filled silence when it became too heavy. But there was a hesitation now, a slight delay before each word, as if he measured them more carefully. Reed returned to his routines with precision, but something in his certainty had been altered. He checked things more often, repeated actions that had once been automatic. He no longer trusted the idea that everything could be explained if examined closely enough. Mendoza remained steady, as he always had, but his silence carried a different weight. It was no longer just restraint. It was acceptance of something that did not need to be spoken to exist. Kowalski continued to lead. His orders did not change. His expectations remained the same, but those who watched him closely could see the difference in the way he paused. Just slightly longer than before, when counting his men. 1, 2, 3, 4. The number never varied, and it was always noticed. Weeks passed, then months. Then months. The war moved forward, as wars do, carrying men through events that replaced one memory with another, layering experiences until earlier moments became less immediate, but not this one. This one did not fade. It remained fixed. The ridge was not always in sight, but it was never far from thought. Sometimes, during quiet moments, one of them would glance in its direction without meaning to. Sometimes, in the middle of routine, a name would surface briefly in conversation, then disappear just as quickly as if it had been spoken by accident. Harper. A pause. Then something else. The war continued. Then, eventually, it began to end. The shift was gradual at first. Fewer operations. Less movement. A sense, faint but growing, that something was changing beyond the immediate horizon. Then the armistice came. The fighting stopped. Not completely. Not in a way that erased what had already happened, but enough to change the structure of each day. The urgency lessened. The tension eased, though it did not disappear entirely. Men began to think about leaving, about going home, about the lives that had been placed on hold. For some, it was a return. For others, it was something more uncertain. Ray spoke of it one evening, sitting outside with Reed and Mendoza as the light faded. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "All this time, you're just trying to get through the next day. Then suddenly, you're thinking about what comes after." Reed nodded slightly. "It's not sudden. It feels sudden." Mendoza looked out toward the ridge, his expression unchanged. It was always coming. Ray exhaled softly. "Yeah, I guess it was." A pause followed. Then Ray spoke again, quieter this time. He should be here for it. No one needed to ask who he meant. Reed looked down briefly, then back up. "He would have been." Mendoza said nothing. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was familiar, the kind that had formed around Daniel's absence and remained ever since. One by one, orders came. Transfers, reassignments, discharges. The unit began to break apart, not suddenly, but steadily, each man moving on to whatever waited for him beyond the war. Ray left first. He said his goodbyes with a forced lightness, shaking hands, offering words that tried to carry more certainty than he felt. "Take it easy," he said to Reed, "and try not to overthink everything." Reed gave a faint, almost invisible smile. "You try not to underthink it." Ray laughed softly, then turned to Mendoza. "Stay steady," he said. Mendoza nodded once. "Always." Ray hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you ever hear anything." "About him?" Mendoza held his gaze. "I will." Ray nodded, then turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared beyond the structures of the camp. Red left, not long after. His departure was quieter, his words fewer, his movements precise, even in leaving. Kowalski remained until the end. He oversaw the final transitions, the last reports, the closing of records that could be closed. Daniel's file was not one of them. It remained open, unresolved. When Kowalski finally left, he did not look back at the ridge, not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much. And so the war ended. Men returned home. Fields were tended again, roads filled with familiar sounds. Life resumed, as it always does, but not everything returned with them. Some things remained where they had been left, on a narrow ridge. In the cold, in the space between one step and the next. And for those who had been there, the war might have ended. But that moment never did. Chapter 12. The File That Never Closed. Years passed in ways that were both slow and sudden. At first, everything felt immediate. The return home, the adjustment to ordinary life. The small routines that once felt natural and now required effort. Then, gradually, those routines reclaimed their place. Days filled themselves. Seasons turned. Time moved forward without asking permission. But some things did not move with it. Daniel Harper's name remain, not in conversation, not often, but in records, in files, in places where time did not soften details, only preserved them. The file was thin. That was the first thing anyone noticed. It did not carry the weight of a story fully told. It held only fragments, dates, locations, brief accounts written in precise language that avoided anything it could not confirm. Name, Harper, Daniel J. Rank, Private First Class. Status, missing in action. Location, Korean Peninsula, Ridge Patrol Sector. Details, disappearance, during night movement. No confirmed cause. No physical evidence recovered. It was all correct, and none of it explained anything. The file moved through hands over the years. Clerks reviewed it. Officers signed off on updates that did not change the outcome. Investigators glanced through it when lists were compiled or cases revisited. Each time, the result was the same. No new information. No new direction. No closure. It was not forgotten, but it was not solved. In Iowa, the house remained. Time had touched it, as it touches everything. The paint had worn slightly along the edges. The fence Daniel had fixed had been repaired again more than once. The fields continued their quiet cycle, unchanged in purpose, if not in detail. Inside, his mother kept the letter, not the telegram that had been folded and placed away, but the last letter Daniel had written before he left, the one he had taken his time with, the one he had read twice before sealing. She did not read it often. She did not need to. She knew the words. She kept it in a drawer near the table, where it could be reached easily, but was never in the way. Sometimes she would open the drawer and rest her hand there, not touching the letter, just knowing it was still where it had always been. His father spoke of him less as the years went on, not because he had forgotten, but because there was nothing new to say. When people asked, he answered simply. He didn't come back. If they asked more, he would add, they never found him. Most did not press further. The uncertainty made people uncomfortable. They preferred endings. Daniel's story did not have one, and so it remained where it was. In between, elsewhere, the men who had been on the ridge carried it in their own ways. Ray returned to a life he had once imagined clearly. The details changed over time, as they always do, but the shape remained. Work, family, responsibilities that filled the space of each day. He spoke of the war when asked, told stories that people expected to hear, but not that one. Not often. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world had settled into stillness, he would think about it again. Not the whole event. Just a moment. A step. The space behind him where someone had been. And the absence that followed. Rita approached it differently. He tried, for a long time, to understand it. He revisited the details in his mind, again and again, examining each possibility, each explanation that could be tested against what he remembered. He read accounts of similar incidents, searched for patterns, for anything that might place Daniel's disappearance within a known framework. He found nothing that matched. Eventually, he stopped looking for an answer, not because he accepted the lack of one, but because he recognized that none would come. Mendoza carried it quietly. He did not speak of it unless directly asked, and of Anten, his answers remained brief. He was there, he would say. Then he wasn't. For him, that was enough. Not as an explanation, but as a truth. Kowalski, in his later years, reviewed the file once more. It had been some time since he had seen it. The pages looked the same. The words unchanged. The absence preserved exactly as it had been recorded. He read through it slowly, his eyes moving over details he already knew. When he finished, he closed the file and rested his hand on it for a moment. There was nothing to add, nothing to correct, nothing to resolve. He signed the necessary line confirming that the case remained open. Then he set it aside. The file did not end. It continued. Not actively. Not with urgency, but with persistence. It remained in the system, in the records, in the quiet places where unresolved things are kept. Waiting, not for discovery, but for acknowledgement. Because some cases are not closed by answers. They are closed by time. And this one never reached that point. It stayed where it had always been, between what was known and what was not, between presence and absence, between a man who had once stood in a line and the space that no longer held him. And in that space, the file remained open, not because it was being worked on, but because it could not be finished. Chapter 13. The Fifth Man. There are places that do not change, not because time forgets them, but because they hold something that time cannot move. The Ridge was one of those places. Long after the war had ended, long after the men who had walked it had gone their separate ways, it remained exactly where it had always been, silent, exposed, and unchanged. Wind still crossed it in the same low patterns. The ground still shifted under careful steps. The narrow path still curved along the edge, where the land dropped away into shadow. Nothing marked what had happened there. No sign. No memory carved into the stone. Only the shape of the path itself, waiting as it always had. If someone walked it now, they would see nothing unusual. Just a ridge like any other. A place defined by height and distance, by uneven ground and open sky. There would be no indication that once 5 men had crossed it in the dark, and that only 4 had returned. But memory does not belong to places alone. It belongs to those who carry it. Years later, the moment still lived in fragments. Small, precise pieces that refused to fade completely. A step taken, a voice heard. The brief sense of someone just behind you, close enough to feel without seeing. Ray remembered the spacing, the way the line had held together, the quiet certainty that no one had fallen behind. And then the moment when that certainty broke, not with a sound, but with a realization. Reed remembered the pattern, the logic of movement, the structure that should have made sense. He remembered how every detail aligned except the one that mattered, the one that could not be explained. Mendoza remembered the presence, not as a sound or a sight, but as something understood without being spoken. A man ahead of him. A space that was not empty until it was. Kowalski remembered the count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the space that followed. Each of them carried a different piece. None of them carried the whole, and that was what remained. Not the event itself, but the absence of its explanation. The world moved on, as it always does. New events replaced old ones. New names took the place of those that had been spoken before. The ridge became just another location on a map, its history reduced to lines in a record, its significance known only to those who had been there. But the story did not end. It could not, because it was never resolved. There was no final moment. No discovery. No answer that closed the space Daniel Harper had left behind. There was only the continuation of that space, carried forward through time, unchanged in its meaning. Somewhere in that continuation, the question remained, what happened in the space between one step and the next? No one answered it. No one could. And so the story returned, not to a conclusion, but to the place where it began, the ridge, the cold, the line moving forward in silence. 5 men stepping carefully along a narrow path, each one trusting the one ahead, each one certain of the one behind. The rhythm steady, the spacing intact, the night holding its shape. And then, a moment, small, unmarked, unseen. A step taken, a presence lost. The line continuing, for men moving forward. One no longer there. Not fallen. Not left behind. Not found. Just gone. And in that absence, something remained. Not a ghost. Not a memory. But a possibility that could not be dismissed. That somewhere, in a way no one understood, the line had not broken for everyone. That somewhere, the fifth man had continued, still walking, still moving through a night that never ended, still part of a line that no longer existed anywhere else. The thought did not belong to reason. It did not fit within the structure of what could be explained. But it lingered, because there was nothing to replace it. 5 men walked into the dark. Only 4 came back. And somewhere, beyond the reach of search, beyond the limits of memory, beyond the edges of understanding, the fifth man never stopped walking.